Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Powerful Perspectives. I'm Brandon and today I'd like to talk to you about something that is pretty important. It's kind of near and dear to my heart, and it's a theme or topic that's been kind of discussed a lot recently across social media and interpersonal relationships in a bunch of different places. And it's a really important concept, but one I think that is often misconstrued, misunderstood, sometimes misapplied, and that I think deserves some clarification. And that is the topic of boundaries. I want to discuss what boundaries are and what they are not, because I think it's really important for us to understand this in our interpersonal relationships, in our professional relationships, in our familial relationships, like family, friends, romantic relationships. It's important to know what constitutes a boundary and what does not. The main thing to to understand, I think, is really the distinction between boundaries and accommodations. Boundaries are not accommodations, and that goes both ways, in the sense that a true, sincere, authentic, real boundary, like a proper boundary, is not just merely an accommodation or a preference made on a whim. It needs to be treated a lot more heavily, it needs to be considered a lot more deeply. It needs to be respected a lot more than just a whimsical personal preference. On the other hand, kind of going backwards or going the other direction, a personal preference made on a whim, just like a preferred accommodation, doesn't constitute a boundary either. A boundary is something that is aimed and focused at preserving and protecting someone's health, whether that be physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, a person's health, a person's safety, or a person's comfort. And comfort, again, related to safety, related to security. It's not just like comfort as in like, oh, well, like sitting back in a lazy boy. Like I would rather have 5 pillows than 2, right? Because it's more comfortable. I'm not talking about that kind of comfort. More that like surfacey, kind of type of comfort. Here I'm talking about like if something makes me feel uncomfortable, as in like unsafe or insecure. Yeah. So those are, I think, the things that we need to focus on when we're looking at boundaries. Boundaries are meant to communicate to another person what those things are that are necessary for us. And again, it can be very personal, because we all have very different personal histories, we have different experiences, we have been through different things that have affected us in different ways, right? And so a place where I might feel safe, and where, the environment and the circumstances around me might not bother me at all, may to someone else be very triggering, and very anxiety inducing, and may cause a lot of discomfort, a lot of distrust, a lot of feelings of being unsafe. And that might come, again, just from their background, right? And that needs to be respected as such. But it needs to be something, again, that it's not taken lightly. And so we need to remember that it's just like, oh, like, it's not, well, I just don't like this atmosphere. It's just not catering to my desires or my preferences, and thus I'm going to label it as being triggering, or I'm going to label it as crossing my boundaries. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about really a fundamental feeling of security and trust and safety, and how that has to do with other people, specifically other people's decisions, actions, choices in relation to ourselves. So, for example, if someone sits too close to you, right, and it makes you feel uncomfortable, because maybe you have had a traumatic experience where someone was too close and they did things like, and it triggers fear, right? It triggers a feeling of unsafety for whatever reason. You don't have maybe you don't know that person very well, you haven't developed trust, right? That you don't have a background with that person where you feel comfortable with them and they are too close to you. That can be a boundary, right? Because it involves another person and their actions or their interaction with you, and it's directly related to safety, security, potentially one's health, right? It's really based on that safety atmosphere. Whereas if you say, like if you go to a party and you say, okay, the music is too loud for my taste, like I'm not liking, the music, I'm not liking the volume, I'm not liking how loud it is, that's not a boundary cross, right? We could debate whether that's even necessarily triggering. I mean, there could potentially be an experience in someone's life where there was loud music playing when a traumatic experience happened, and there's an association there that has happened, right? And so that loud music can potentially be triggering, right? But it's not necessarily a boundary that has been crossed. A boundary has to be based in someone else's actions, right? And it needs to be something that they can or cannot, or that they can change, right? That they can do something about, to preserve their respect for you and to respect what you need in order to feel safe. Boundaries, again, also another point that's really important to consider with boundaries is that there needs to be a consequence when a boundary has been crossed. And that consequence isn't complaining. It's not just making a scene and yelling that you didn't get your own way, right? That would be what people often do to defend things that are labeled as boundaries but are not boundaries. They're preferences and accommodations. When someone is not meeting your preferences and accommodations, again, those are just personal preferences. They're made kind of on a whim, maybe not. I mean, some people might say, oh, no, this is a lot more serious than just a whim, right? All the same, it's a preference or an accommodation. Something just isn't to your liking, and you can complain about that all you want, but that is not a crossed boundary. A boundary, again, has to do with fundamental safety and security. And the way that you defend that is by removing yourself from a situation. So a boundary could be, for example, the way someone talks to you. If someone is not showing a fundamental level of respect, and respect, again, not necessarily being like, let's not conflate respect with catering to my preferences, right? Respect is it's different from that. It's not just if you do something that I don't like, that is being disrespectful to me. Respect is when you don't value the other person as a human being, right? You don't treat them kindly. You don't give them the benefit of the doubt. You talk down to them. You exercise force or domination or like a control or manipulation over a person, right? You treat them as less than, like looking down on. That all factors into respect. Respect is when you see someone at eye level with yourself, right? It's not when you revere someone or idolize someone. That is also different from respect. It's not a looking up to, it's a looking at eye level. And it's respecting the other person as you respect yourself. And that can be hard for people who don't respect themselves or who think too much of themselves. It can be hard, right? But that's kind of where respect happens. It happens at eye level. It happens when you treat another person the way that you would want to be treated. And again, that it can get, I don't want to overcomplicate things. So sometimes people want to be treated in ways that are not healthy for themselves, right? And so again, this needs to be based on a level of health and safety. But that's kind of where respect is, right? And so if someone comes at you and they are insulting, and again, insulting probably needs to be defined here too. Insulting doesn't just mean saying something that you don't like. Insulting means disregarding the other person and talking to them, again, like less than. It means not holding positive regard for that other person, not esteeming them as an equal, right? And so if you go to someone and you are just tearing them apart, right? You're pointing at all of their weaknesses and flaws in front of everybody who's around there, right? And you're just making a scene about this other person and really just pulling them down. That is not respectful. That's not kind, right? And the person who's being talked to that way, that could be a boundary that they set up. They say, you know what? I don't want to be spoken to that way. And the consequence to such a boundary, or to someone crossing that kind of a boundary, would be, okay, if you continue talking to me this way, I am going to remove myself from the conversation. I'm going to walk away. Or if it's on a phone call, like, I'm going to hang up the call, right? There's a consequence that comes as a response, or as a consequence to the breach of that boundary. And more often than not, that the type of consequence that follows is a removal. It's I am going to take myself away from this environment, from this interaction, and that's a lot of the reason why. And this could be a really good clarifying point as well, between defending boundaries versus defending preferences. When you defend a boundary, oftentimes you do so by taking personal responsibility, because the boundary is yours, right? And it's there intended to protect you. And so, and it's a very personal thing, and it's a very, I hesitate to say subjective, because subjective kind of, it gets this connotation of something being weak or being like negotiable. Boundaries are not negotiable. They shouldn't be negotiable. One's safety and security should not be a negotiable thing. But it is subjective in the sense that it is personal, in the sense that it is individual to you, and it may not present the same way in someone else. You know, another person around you might not have that same boundary. Maybe there's a certain topic that you do not like or want to talk about because, again, it triggers something in you. You do not feel safe. You do not feel comfortable. Again, like the safe type of comfortable when discussing that topic. It is something that is just, it's not a comfortable, secure, safe area for you to be in terms of conversation with, especially with people maybe that you don't know, right? So maybe you set that as a boundary. Say, okay, like I'm not going to talk about this topic with you. Another person, you know, the person to your right, person to your left, may be completely fine with that topic. They don't have any problem with it. It's not an issue for them. And so for them, it's not a boundary, right? And here's where the difference happens. When you set a boundary, or when you communicate a boundary, you communicate it as a desire, right? You say, look, I do not feel comfortable discussing this. And so you're not making a decision for someone else, but you are communicating that, okay, if you continue to engage in this behavior, or if you continue to discuss this topic, or whatever the specific example might be, but if you continue to do this thing that infringes on my boundary, I am going to have to leave. Like, I'm going to remove myself from this from this area, right? I am going to limit communication. That's how we enforce boundaries. It's by proactively taking ourselves, or creating distance between that thing that is bothering us and the other person, right? And there is a personal responsibility from the other person as well, right? You are expecting them to respect you. But the tricky thing here is that we cannot choose and decide and act for other people. we just can't do that. Like forcing other people to make certain decisions, that's manipulation, that's like authoritarianism, that is really scary stuff. When you start forcing other people to do things a certain way, and requiring them to do it, that gets a little bit scary, right? In terms of agency, in terms of the freedom of choice, right? What you can decide is not necessarily how other people act or what they choose or what they do, but you can decide how that interacts with you. That's where the boundary is. So you say, okay, around me, this is not okay. And what happens in the consequence is you can choose, and this is where the consequence kind of blends together or finds balance with the other person's actions. You basically say, you can continue to do this. Like, I'm not telling you, that this is right or wrong or whatever. Like, I'm not making the decision for you in terms of what you do or do not want to do, or what you do or do not want to talk about. What I am saying is that this is something that is not okay for me. And so if you choose to discuss this topic, if you choose to engage in this activity or whatever, then I am going to remove myself from that situation so that my boundary is intact, right? That does not affect me. I am not involved in that discussion, in that interaction, in that action, that activity, whatever it is that infringes on your boundary. I'm going to remove myself from the situation so that is no longer affecting me, or that is no longer in my environment. So if you would like me to remain here, like if you would like to continue to talk with me, if you would like to continue to interact or hang out or, enjoy different activities, then that is a condition. It's a condition on having me participate. It's a condition on me staying here, because in order for me to stay here, I need to feel safe. And if I don't feel safe, again, I'm going to remove myself. And so that's where the choice happens. The choice is a condition. And it's a condition based on my actions. Like, I will stay here as long as you continue to respect my boundary. The moment that you don't respect my boundary, you lose the privilege of my presence, right? That is the consequence. Like, I will remove myself, and we no longer get to share this time together. That's the consequence. On the flip side, how that looks differently when someone is trying to enforce a preference or an accommodation, they expect the other person to change, right? The other person has to do the thing differently. And the final line is still seen on the other person's side. So the person who is trying to defend their accommodation or their preference, they will swear up and down and get really angry and get very vocal until the other person does what they want them to do. There's no personal accountability. There's no personal action. It's all seen as like the other person's responsibility. It's all pushed and viewed and kind of scapegoated or assigned to the other. It's all pointed outwards. The world needs to accommodate me. The other person needs to meet my preference. The other person or other people need to change this so that it's what I like. It's all focused on the outside. And there's no personal responsibility of, I'm going to do something differently so that this aligns better with what I want or what I feel comfortable with. So it's a very, very different outlook, right? There's the attitude of personal responsibility to guard and protect one's own boundaries and to remove themselves from situations where those boundaries aren't being respected and kept. Versus, on the other hand, there's just an insistence of everyone else doing the work, everyone else changing, everyone else accommodating, with the accommodating and like the personal preference kind of side of things. So just some food for thought. I think it's really important to recognize these differences. Language has meaning. I'm sharing all of these thoughts, and for those who don't know, for those who aren't really familiar with my background, I am a languages teacher, like a multilingual languages teacher, as well as I'm just in the process of getting licensed as a counselor, as a clinical counselor or therapist. So I have background both in language and in psychology. And so I'm really passionate about these things. I'm really passionate about the language that we use, because language has meaning and it has weight, and we assign certain weight or value to different words that we use, and we use them strategically to get certain reactions from people, to evoke certain emotions. We can be quite provocative with our language. And we can be quite emotional with our language, and we try to make arguments using language. I mean, it's one of the only things that we can use really to make an argument is language, but it can be used properly and carefully and critically to make arguments, and it can be used very irrationally and very, again, provocatively, very offensively, very emotionally, where it's kind of this difference between relying on logic and reason, and being reasonable, being respectful with the other person, to make arguments and to have discussions, versus being very emotional and very focused on evoking an emotional response in the other person, right? And kind of manipulating through emotion. They're very different tactics in terms of argumentation and debate and discussion and communication. And they vary quite widely in terms of their effectiveness. They have very different consequences. And so I see this happening. I see this happening in the social circles that I engage with and that I'm a part of. I see this happening on social media. I see this happening in just the media in large, whether that be like television, movies, etc., right? Music to an extent, where some of these really important concepts are not always understood fully, or even if they are perhaps understood, they're definitely not communicated clearly and effectively and correctly. And so my hope is just to clarify some differences. And I know that there will be a lot of people who don't agree and who get upset and triggered about this. More often than not, it's the people who are using accommodation and personal preference as their motive who will be the most offended by this, right? Because it means that they need to step up and take personal responsibility, and recognize the difference between a boundary versus a personal preference or an accommodation. It's those who like using strong language to get their own way, who will not be the happiest with this message, probably. But those who do know the difference between a boundary and an accommodation or a personal preference, I hope will find value in this. And I hope that some who are on the fence and maybe kind of in between might be able to recognize the difference and take some personal accountability, and maybe we can check ourselves a little bit more, right? My hope is that we can all be respectful and kind and loving and respectful of each other's boundaries, but really be clear about what those are. Again, it's our personal responsibility to communicate what our boundaries are to those around us, because we cannot expect those around us to help us to feel safe and to respect and value our boundaries if they do not know what they are. It reminds me of a quote that I really love from Jordan Peterson. He says, I cannot hit a target that you will not specify. And I really, really love that. It's this idea that, like, if I don't know what the target is, if I don't know what the expectation is, I have no hope of meeting it or finding it, right? I mean, you can look at probability of that happening by accident, but there's not going to be any reliable consistency with that, right? And he or she or who is trying to meet those boundaries but doesn't know what they are cannot justifiably be blamed for missing them, because again, they cannot hit a target that they cannot see, that has not been specified, right? It's not fair. It's not a just thing to require or expect from someone. So when we are setting boundaries and defending those boundaries, they need to be clearly communicated, and they need to be communicated consistently, right? And there has to be, again, that defense, that there has to be a consequence. Look, if you pass this boundary, if you step over this line that is important for me and for my safety and my comfort, my security, there are going to be consequences, right? I am going to limit communication with you. I'm going to limit interaction with you. I am not, like, this is not okay for me, and so I will not engage in this kind of behavior. I will not be contributing it to our interactions, to our conversation. I will not bring up this topic myself. I will not do this. I will not contribute this. And if it is contributed by you or by someone else, I will not stand for it. I will leave. And so that has to be followed through with, right? Because that's another thing that becomes really, really confusing. And again, it's not the other person's fault. Is if you do not defend your boundary by following through on what you say the consequence will be, right? If you do not leave, if you just say, okay, I don't like talking about this subject, let's say, I don't like this topic, it makes me feel uncomfortable, it makes me feel unsafe, I don't feel good here, but you stay there and you continue listening, and the other people, like, they don't change, and you don't leave, that it may be a boundary for you, but you're not defending it. And from the perspective of the other, they cannot be expected to recognize and value that as an actual boundary, because you're not treating it that way. They cannot defend a boundary that you're not defending for yourself, because they have no way of knowing the legitimacy of it. If you are willing to compromise on your own boundaries, you give them license to do the same. And again, that's a very uncomfortable feeling. It may be triggering, to some people. It may be uncomfortable to some people to hear that, but it's the truth. And so, yeah, my hope and my invitation for all of us, and myself included, I'm still working on this in my own life. I'll be very honest, I have a very hard time establishing and communicating and defending my own boundaries. It's not something that comes naturally to me. I grew up as a very giving and a very outward focused person who sought the comfort and the joy and enjoyment and happiness of those around me, oftentimes at my own expense. And this is something that I have had to learn, is that I do no one any service by taking the hit for things that are not comfortable for me and that hurt me. And I've had to learn, to set my own boundaries and to communicate them, and to communicate them consistently, and to follow through on defending them, follow through on those consequences. Because through that whole learning experience, I compromised. I compromised on my own boundaries, and then everyone else around me that I was asking to keep those boundaries, they compromised on them, right? And I was caught in in this area of cognitive dissonance where I wanted to be angry with them, but I couldn't justifiably be angry with them, right? Because it's not their fault if I am not being clear with my communication. And if I'm not being consistent with my own expectations, then again, they can't hit them, right? They can't support me in those things either, because it's not clear what they are, and that's not their fault. It's mine. So it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable because it means taking on personal responsibility. And we live in a world and a society, especially, I'm not saying that all countries and all cultures are like this, but certainly in, I would say, the great majority of the westernized world, we live in a greater society that doesn't like to take personal responsibility, where we try to kind of outsource that personal responsibility as much as possible. It's the cultural trend that we see is quite pervasive. We can see this in politics. We can see this in news. We can see this in media. We can see this in a number of different systems and organizations. And we can see a number of systems and organizations crumbling and struggling because of this. Because a system that is not built on personal responsibility and accountability, it can't stand. It won't. It will crumble unavoidably. So it's an uncomfortable truth, but at the same time, it's an empowering one for those who decide to take it on, because it gives you control. It doesn't give you control over other people, but it does give you control over your own safety, over your own security, over your own comfort, your own peace of mind. You're able to take some control over that by communicating what is and is not okay for you, and then by removing yourself from those situations that breach on that. And I understand that this is not always possible. You know, there are some people who are caught in situations where they really do feel trapped, and where in some cases they may very well be trapped. And I don't mean to dance on those circumstances and overlook them and take them lightly. I recognize that there are some people who are in cycles of grave danger, right? And where setting boundaries in the way that I've described sounds like a very, very dangerous thing to do. And so I don't mean to overlook that. I don't mean to take that lightly. My aim here is just to call attention to what things are versus what they aren't, and to ask us to be careful with our language and careful with our interactions with others, and to check ourselves and ask, okay, is this a legitimate boundary? Or is this a personal preference and an accommodation? And I hope that if we do start thinking about that critically, there might be some positive changes in our interactions with those around us. Anyway, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it, and I'll see you guys next time.